Let's talk markets, Fed, interest rates, inflation, and so much more with a guy who you probably need to know even better than you may already. David Zervos is here. He's chief market strategist at Jefferies, CNBC contributor. And yes, now he is officially on the list of candidates being considered for the job of Fed chairman. So good morning. Now, do you have to watch your words in a different way, do you feel like?
I think that's probably fair to say. I would also say that, I kind of have to come at this a little bit differently than I've done in the past, where I talk more about what I think the Fed should do as opposed to what I've done for the last 15 years, which is at Jefferies, and even before that, which is talk about what the Fed will do. So I'm here to talk about a much more broader set of topics.
Before we get into any of that, though, just tell us, the backstory on getting on this list, what kind of phone calls you've got, and I know that you have a relationship and you've known the Treasury Secretary for a long time.
I have. I've known Scott for quite a while. He's a wonderful guy and an amazing, he's transitioned into an amazing Treasury Secretary, but he's an amazing trader as well. And so I've known Scott. I've met the president a few times, and I've been involved with a few other folks that are part of the administration and were part of the campaign as well. So I sort of got myself closer to Washington in the last couple of years. And
we're pulling for you so much, just so we can say David Zervos, Fed chair and CNBC contributor. Would you give that up?
I would, if I have to, I would. I wouldn't. If they tell me, they're going to make you give up a lot of things.
That's something to think about before you accept. Can you manage? I was kidding about pulling for you. We're pulling for everybody.
We're other CNBC contributors that have been on Fed chair lists in the past.
I don't think so.
I don't know. Lots of guess, but I don't know.
Although I did
not a contributor.
I think the president, when he called in, he did talk about how CNBC was fertile ground for potential Fed chair.
He did
as
well.
There you are.
And there used to be Trump Tuesdays.
So here's the big question.
Yeah.
What would you do? What would you do? Now, what do you think they will do or should do? What would you do?
I mean, what I would do is try to coalesce the committee around the idea that policy is actually quite restrictive. I think that argument needs to be made, and that argument is something I've been making in my research notes and in my analysis now for the better part of 8 to 9 months, basically going back into the basically the fall of last year. And the idea, it's a little bit wonky, but Kevin Warsh has been kind of pushing on this idea, a good friend as well, that the balance sheet of the Fed has now contracted to the point of almost being neutral after being very stimulative for a very long time. And so you're left now with rates at a much more restrictive rate without that extra kicker from the balance sheet. And so we really need to get rates back toward a more neutral level.
So it's not a Fed funds versus 10-year.
It's much more about the combination of the balance sheet and the rate structure. And I think someone needs to go in and argue and present with the 11 other voting members on that committee a cogent case for why rates are more restrictive than maybe the Fed is currently thinking, the staff is currently thinking, and the street economists are currently thinking.
Can I ask you, and maybe this is like a deep sort of like dark arts of what's happening here. But a number of people that I've talked to that are living in the realm that you're living in are all trying to see what Jay Powell either says on Friday in Jackson Hole, but maybe even more importantly, does in September, because that will be probably the last major decision he will make before somebody gets named. And the reason I mention this is there is a view, I don't know if you agree with this view, that if he doesn't cut rates in September, the president, first of all, will think that Jay is thumbing his nose at him, but B, would want to find somebody who is super dovish, somebody who he knows he could be put in there who would get the job done effectively. But if he lowers rates, that maybe it somehow takes a little bit of the pressure off in terms of the kind of person he might select. Am I reading tea leaves too much?
That seems a little deep in the weeds for me. I think the idea of this meeting being such a critical meeting is probably, I wouldn't go there. I just wouldn't go there. I would argue that this meeting is an important meeting, but the importance of what Jay says on forward guidance or what the committee is doing in these set of meetings leading up to a pretty significant leadership change at the board are less and less significant. In fact, it's becoming more irrelevant. We're going to have a committee by May of next year that's made up of 4 Trump nominees. It's going to be Michelle Bowman and Chris Waller, who were already picked by the president, then the seat for Adriana Kugler, and the seat that Jay vacates in May. So you're going to have 4 out of 7 board members that are effectively...
That's some of the news I'm seeing today.
What's that?
About, maybe another one with some of the news that's out today about some others. Santelli's on this, but we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later. But my wonky question is, how does the balance sheet that you described get you to the risk being much more on growth than inflation? Why do you think that the nature of what you described with the balance sheet is, why do you think that inflation is not a problem when it seems so sticky to get down to 2 for the last mile?
I think it's been a little sticky. It's come a long way, Joe. It's come from 9.1 down to 2 and change.
But if you want 2, we're not 2. We're headed back above 3. It could be, right?
This is the art of central banking, right? You're balancing a 4.2% unemployment rate with a 2 and change inflation rate. You're looking at the future and saying, what are the inflationary pressures? We've got demographics, we've got AI.
1 to 3 is good enough for government work, is what you're saying. 1 to 3 is good enough.
Maybe when you start working for the government, you get 8-foot gimmies instead of 2-foot gimmies. I don't know.
No doubt.
I think that's probably fair. But I guess
I would. Just the size of the balance sheet, though, isn't it still more than $6 trillion?
$6 trillion, but it's about 20% of GDP. You remember, it's related to the size of the economy, and it was 40% of GDP at the peaks.
Right, at the peak, it was more than $9 trillion, but before 2008, it was $1 trillion.
Well, and that was before we went to this ample reserves kind of more highly regulated structure, where I think I would kind of put a neutral balance sheet at where we were in 2019, when we had rates at about 2%. Flat, yield curve at 2, and the balance sheet was 20% of GDP. The unemployment rate was 3.5. Inflation was 1.6.
We just never get back to these being out of these emergency contingencies where the Fed is doing so much to keep things afloat.
I mean, we've got those great tools if we need them, Becky, and I'm more than excited to use them if they need to be used. But the point is, if we go back to 2019, I don't want to go back to 2008 because the structure of the market's changed so much. That was a neutral place. There were no rate hikes, no rate cuts priced in. We were sitting at a 2% yield curve flat. We had a balance sheet at 20% of GDP, no QE, no QT. It was about as neutral as it could get, with the Fed at its mandate. Full employment at 3.5 and price stability at inflation under 1. That's a good spot. That's the place we should be looking to get back to. The balance sheet is back at 20% of GDP, within spitting distance.
Let me ask you, though, to think about...
Rates are not.